How stupid are you? The guy at my Target who uses the gym in an adjacent building. He always uses the handicapped spaces and looks like a normal athletic guy. One day a seabag is relentlessly yelling at him about where he parked and he yanks off his prosthetic leg and waves it at her. The amount of people who feel the need to be parking enforcement or cops is absurd. If he has a placard or plate, leave them the F alone. If you still think they are abusing someone else's placard or plate, call the police and move the F on. The amount of people with invisible disabilities is absurd and these people need to leave their effing nose out of others' business. I have a fused right ankle and a couple of other mobility related shenanigans and legit have been screamed at on buses and stuff because I refuse to move for people. They see a young person sitting in a disabled bit or whatever and suddenly lose their collective shit at the prospect someone younger than them may be sitting there for a reason. Greed. I just felt I could add an example of my own about why effing with people because they don't look disabled is a D move. But I also want to add that it is okay to ask. No one, or at least no one who doesn't also have some mental disability, will get offended by being asked if they are disabled. It's a yes or no question. Man, I have a chronic muscle disorder that's slowly destroying my left leg, but I don't look disabled and I've been so afraid to get a tag for my car because I don't want to get yelled at by some crazy person. So I drag my leg into stores. I have literal anxiety about getting one, not to mention how much it hurts mentally to know I'll need it forever. Precisely. I've had mine since my early 20s. I've also had osteoarthritis and complex regional pain syndrome since my late teens and early 20s due to Ehlers-Danlos and other genetic stuff. I look perfectly healthy but I fall a lot. When I fall most of the time I get seriously hurt. I was finally able to leave my abusive husband and now I live alone. If I get another stupid injury I will lose my independence and have to find a place to live with others, even though my apartment is somewhat accessible. Parking lots are not maintained like floors are, they're like a minefield when you're disabled. So I get a lot of stares, especially as I don't drive with the tag up, I just put it up when I'm parked. My mom would make a lot of snide remarks when I was a kid about disabled people getting the best parking spaces. Now she's fat and lazy and has needed her knees replaced early because of her lifestyle. It's kind of infuriating that she manufactured her medical problems when she could eat better, or just skip the bag of Snickers and M&Ms, and move more. Instead, she focused on how terrible she had things and how unfair it was that she couldn't get accommodation. I'd love to park in the back, be able to do the long walk, and have the bonus of not dealing with the holes like my mother. You have to be careful if you're a neighborhood watch vigilante wannabe cop. If your hunches aren't right you're going to look like a complete. Did you just tell them to have the police F with a disabled person? No need to potentially ill someone for a parking violation. I overheard a similar one at my gym once over the handicapped toilet. The guy said something to the effect of, "Ma'am, if you really wish I can pull down my pants and show you why I use the handicapped toilet." But I wouldn't look like the bad guy after that. Just a reminder that some people that are overweight also have disabilities and you shouldn't judge people solely based on weight. People with mobility issues often gain weight because it's harder or impossible to exercise, and permanently restricting calories far below a normal healthy adult just to maintain weight is difficult. My mom was personally a victim of this mentality. She had a woman follow her around the store screaming at her, "You're a bad person. You don't need that cart." She has degenerative disc disease which lets her walk about the distance from her car to the door but not enough to stop standing up. She was also going through chemo. But thanks to the internet and subreddits like, now banned, FPH, people think it's fine to get in people's faces and scream at them. It's even better than that. I do a little amateur stand-up, and amongst the other comics very little of our story-based material is fabricated from whole cloth. A most likely scenario is that the setup happened, rude woman, but he just did what most people would do and be too stunned to stick up for themselves. Then, fuming about it for hours after, concoct a what if I had scenario as a revenge fantasy. Then you just get up on stage and convincingly tell what you wish had happened instead. The best part is it doesn't even have to be that funny. If the story is about an absurd way you took the piss out of a bully, people will cheer even if they don't laugh. For example, I've got a busted beehole, so sometimes I have to buy hemorrhoid medicine at the grocery store. On these days, I'm very glad for the invention of self-checkout because it's so embarrassing. But sometimes it's slow at the grocery store, and so they make the cashiers stand out front of their checkout lines to try and invite people to come check out with a human. So I'm walking towards self-checkout and a UF woman cashier says, "Oh, sir, I can check you out right here." Here is where reality and comedy diverge. In reality, I just said no thank you and kept going. But on stage what happened is that I very loudly said, "No, I don't want anyone to know I am buying medicine for my hemorrhoids." I'm not following Hassan's controversy very closely, but from what I understand he was making up stuff for his material that was also very politically/socially motivated. The made-up end to my story is just a dumb, inconsequential punchline. If I were a member of an oppressed group, and I made up stories about my oppression for stage material that is meant to elicit sympathy not just for me but for my group, it ultimately undermines the real oppression the group experiences overall. I heard a version of this from a friend, circa 2008. The context was that an angry old lady demanded a seat in the subway while shouting no respect for the elderly anymore. My friend told me he got up and pretended to be disabled with a walking difficulty. In his account, the lady was quite mortified. But that friend also told me that he saw the most famous person at that time in our country at the very university campus where he studied, doing a commercial. He told me he approached him on a break, as if he wanted to have his signature or something, just to ask a silly question like, "Do you happen to know what time it is?" I guess my friend liked passing on classic stories as first-hand experience. I miss that friend quite a lot. I work with someone who raises pigs for meat as a side hustle. He was telling me the Amish not far away process the meat and make sausages. He said they spice it but it's not spicy. I joked they think ketchup is spicy. He laughed and walked away. A half hour later I hear him on the phone with someone he's selling the meat to and say the Amish processes the meat and adds spices, but it's not too spicy. They think ketchup is spicy. The dude stole my joke. A lot of comedians base their stories on true things that happen to them but embellish or change things here or there to make the story better or the narrative flow better. One example I can think of was Jessa Reed, who tells an amazing story "This Isn't Happening" on YouTube, about her meth addiction. Later I watched her get interviewed by Bert Kreis and she went over the bit and explained a few of the changes that she workshopped in as she changed the story. There were tweaks here and there that punched up things or maybe changed the period between certain events, but the quintessence of the story was still true, as it were. I don't think that's a problem, so long as you stick to certain limits. For example, Hassan Minhaj has been under fire a bit of late for exaggerating some of his stories of experiencing Islamophobia. The biggest issue is that he really embellished a story involving a real person and even used her picture. Now he contends that she and her family were racist toward him, but the story that he tells isn't exactly what happened. To me that's unacceptable. You need to either completely obscure the person's identity, after all, who needs a face to the subject of such a joke? Or stick to the unvarnished truth if it's going to be hung on that person. I'd say Minhaj more than embellished, he seems to have made up stories out of whole cloth. Also his stories aren't just personal, "I was a meth addict," they are political, "I was told I was too brown," "I was profiled and manhandled by law enforcement." I think a lot of people feel that when you're using your own stories to critique society at large, those stories should be true or at least mostly true. Minhaj kind of said in the article about him that his own life is just too boring. I feel like that's a sign that you should figure out a different way to do your comedy. It also doesn't help that he has had a brand of being a truth teller like Stewart and Oliver. I understand Minhaj did not lie in his show, Patriot Act, but I think if Jon Stewart had a stand-up tour where he talked about being profiled/disparaged by for being Jewish, no one would say it's okay that it didn't really happen, it's just his comedy routine. Minhaj claimed that his stories were about 70% true with embellishment. Like that with the one girl whose family was racist toward him, they were, just not the exact way as presented in the story. And considering the Rolling Stone article that outed his fabrications did so largely based on his very own words, we don't really have anything to go on except for what Minhaj himself has said. If he had sat for Rolling Stone and said everything is exactly true, there would be no evidence to the contrary. Instead he said it's about 70-30, and again we have no evidence other than the man's word. Now you might choose to decide that his first admission broke your trust to the extent that you now don't believe anything he says, but I'm more of the mind that the 70-30 ratio is probably pretty damned common amongst comedians. Unless you think thicken entirely a life of quips, bon mots, and witty retorts for every occasion. That being said, I agree that the personal nature of the stories and how they intersected with hate maybe makes it a little more untoward to stretch the truth in those directions. It's more likely because you can't make something up that hasn't happened or isn't? As you said, it's more of a generic confrontation that he has very likely experienced in some form. Arguably anything you think you make up is bound to some form of archaic structure like fantasy novels, ideas, philosophical fiction, or phenomena as in science fiction. The same goes for comedy. She said I was just about to pay. It seems to me that perhaps he unknowingly cut her in line at a self-checkout lane or just the regular checkout aisle. So she was calling him stupid for not paying attention enough to realize he cut her maybe. That's what I derived from the story at least. Setting aside the fact that this never happened to this guy, the mythical woman's motivation was found in her referring to his people. The claim is that this woman started by calling this one guy stupid and then generalized to smear his people, so bigotry is the motivation in this scenario. I don't doubt that this kind of thing happens far more often than it should. I don't believe everything a comedian says. Their job is to make up things to make people laugh and think.
Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.